Just, yeah, I'll just wait till Jerry comes back, but I can start
Okay.
sharing. There we go.
Actually, Leo from China had done a summary of your paper you shared.
Oh,
Uh,
okay. Yeah, I'd be interested in that.
I haven't had a chance to read it yet, but I think he will show up. It's very late in China now, he but anyway, you can start.
Okay, timer started. Uh, Timer is now started. Yes. Okay. I'd like to start with a quote by Paul D. Rock. He talks about two approaches to science. One, experimentation. Two, math. And he's saying that it's amazing that both of these methods work. So there's two alternate equivalent paths, which he suggests is a property of nature. The first one is the concrete technical thinking of cause and effect. That's your observation experiment. Second is the precise definitions of mathematics in abstract technical thought. And he says that there's an overlap, and that's what makes one of the major, how do I say, mysteries of science or properties of science. Similarly, I've found with looking at personality, I can either observe behavior or I can use the model, and there seems to be an overlap between those.
Lorin, could
So,
I interrupt?
yeah,
In general, I don't want to interrupt, but I want to interrupt at this very crucial starting point
okay,
because everything you say is going to follow from this premise or these two
okay,
premises. And so my point is that this is inadequate to explain the cybernetics or the activities of an individual scientist, and that the individual scientist already necessarily has a cognitive view of the world. And so, whatever external system he is looking at, in my opinion, will be an ascription of some representation of that external world or system to his mathematical inclinations or mathematical evaluations or mathematical analysis or mathematical synthesis. So I just want to point out the role of the individual scientist, or in this case, whether it be you or I or Jason or anyone else, plays a crucial role in the discussion and description of what occurs. So thank you.
okay, I agree. And one of the major premises of the model is exactly that thing, trying to uncover what the individual scientist is bringing to this discussion.
Great,
So that's what I'm trying to focus on.
great.
Model. Don't have time to go over the model in detail, but just a very quick overview. There are two axes. The top, there's analytical and associative. So left and it maps basically onto left and right hemisphere. Two ways of labeling information. Emotion, whatever that means, it's an emotional label attached to information, or confidence, which can be thought of how certain am I? How well can I handle the emotion? And then two circuits, the diagonals, abstract and concrete. So abstract, teacher and perceiver, teacher comes up with the speech, perceiver adds meanings to the speech. Concrete, Mercy comes up with the goals, server does the movement to reach the goals. Very, very basic here. And then two kinds of modules. There are the four on the side that deal with content, and then the three in the middle that use this content and transform it. Okay, looking at the stages of processing, the first one, exhorter combines teacher and mercy. Mercy, concrete experiences, teacher, abstract theories. Exhorter, in between, wants practical theories, learns from life, puts those two together, and has to do basic drives of that boredom, boredom, avoiding frustration connected with dopamine. Next stage takes the plans, um, facts, and sequences, sticks them together to form a plan driven by the exhorter, the excitement, and goals, optimization seems to be related to serotonin. And the final one is the secretary of the mind, surface awareness of all modules. And that seems to work with noradrenaline. Big need for that module is freedom with instability. So, yeah. And these modules can function together in one of three ways, and that will be what we'll be concentrating on: mental networks, normal thought, or technical thought. That's what I refer to. We'll start now by looking at mental networks and how that relates to concepts of God. Mental network, basically think of it as a schema that is emotionally imposed. So you have individual memories with emotional labels, but they can connect and form a schema or a network. Once a network forms, then triggering one memory activates the whole thing. And the network will then generate an emotion based on conformity, on whether something is consistent. You can see this in when you go to a strange culture. Everything feels different. It's not wrong or right, it's just different. And that going to a strange culture, it's exciting, but it also generates these feelings of non-conformity that threaten the networks. If that non-conformity continues, you get this feeling of unease and fragmentation. It just feels strange. If you go back to, the person in another culture, you go back to a familiar surroundings, then everything's fine. You feel okay again. If you continue to give the network inconsistent input, it eventually falls apart. You can see that in breaking a habit. And the thing is, the emotions of the memories themselves are different than the emotion of conformity formed by the mental network. So, abused spouse, it feels bad to be in the situation. It feels wrong or different to be outside of the situation. Okay, that's the mechanism. Now let's apply it. Social expectations. When you have interaction with people, it's emotional experiences, and a clump of emotional experiences forms what I call mercy mental networks. Mercy because that's the part that deals with emotional experiences in the mind, and the mind uses these mental networks to represent people. So, for example, your spouse. All these emotional experiences with your spouse form an image of your spouse. A single glance from your spouse is sufficient to trigger an entire mental network with all of its expectations, which means that most social interactions actually happening internally as mental networks are being triggered. And when mental networks come into contact, they form a social hierarchy. And this also works with imaginary people. Santa Claus. We all know what Santa Claus likes and dislikes. And it also provides a cognitive explanation for concepts of God. And we'll look again at Dirac. Notice the date, 1927. So he's saying that primitive people exposed to emotional experiences from the environment personified it using mercy mental networks to represent people, leading to concepts of God, like Santa Claus or God of thunder. And then he says, we don't need that now. We have science. Okay, that's Dirac in 27. Now, let's look at that further. Theories also form mental networks. If you continue to use a theory, it will form a mental network which will generate emotional pressure to interpret a situation in light of that theory when it is triggered. That's related to what I think that's related to what Jerry was saying. So that also can be interpreted as an imaginary person. But what sort of imaginary person? Like if the law of gravity were a person, what sort of person would that be? Verbal, imposing explanation, universal, dealing with general theories, outside of space-time. So that's a cognitive explanation for how the mind forms a concept of a monotheistic God. Looking again at Dirac, now in 1963, he says, nature seems to have fundamental physical laws, mathematical beauty. Why? Well, maybe there's a God. So he's talking about a different concept of God, one based in a teacher mental network, a theory that's turned into a mental network rather than emotional experiences turned into a mental network. Okay, that's concept of God. Now we have to look at the interaction between emotions and knowing that happens within the mind. The basic problem is there's confidence and emotion. Problem is that emotions can overwhelm confidence. I may know, for example, that chocolate cake is fattening, but not when having one right in front of my face. When that happens, it leads to a mindset that one can label as blind faith. How do you deal with that? The scientific method is let's be objective. Let's avoid these emotions, subjective emotions, so that we can stay factual. The religious method is, because religion deals with the emotions, let's use these emotions to impose blind faith or using religious fervor. Confidence, you can gradually gain the confidence to realize, hey, facts are independent of how I feel about something, but that doesn't happen instantly. Now, here's the problem with a method of objective science. That is, that it builds theories using objective facts. But one of my premise is that when you put a theory together, the structure is emotional. It's not that it's made out of emotions, it's that when the facts come together, it creates a teacher emotion of order. And I've found in several instances of where people following this process of objective science tends to implode when encountering this idea that, hey, being objective inherently leads to emotions of understanding, emotions of structure. With Thomas Kuhn, with his paradigms, after 1970, he actually dropped his theory. And Zeki looked at the brain region that is triggered by beauty and ends up coming up with a circular definition of beauty. Very interesting. Two examples that I came across. Okay, now let's look at religion and how you can deal with these emotions, the teacher emotion of order, the mercy emotion of subjective identity. So normally what you have is teacher thought likes to generalize. It always rains. Then perceiver thought comes up with a counterexample. Yes, but what about last Saturday? Now, the easiest way to come up with a general theory is to make a universal statement and get rid of the facts. But all is one. Why? Because that supersedes the facts. And William James talked about religion and mysticism back in 1902. So he talks about these characteristics. Now, that's at the teacher's side. You get what I call an overgeneralization. Mercy side, you get an identification. So you identify, for example, when you're watching on a movie, and you identify with the character there. Well, perceiver thought normally says, you are not that other person. You are this. And if you get that away, you can get identification. So putting those together, you get I am one with everything. And that leads to potent emotions because you've got the strongest theoretical teacher emotion combined with the strongest mercy identification. And that provides a cognitive explanation for mysticism. Now, here's the curious thing. Even though it's an untheory that you get by getting rid of facts, thinking about it will create a teacher mental network that will create a drive to interpret reality in terms of that untheory and talk about it. So you get this contradiction. Writing assumes meaning, but meaning disables mysticism. Uh, Interesting contradiction there. Now, mysticism can coexist with objective science because objective science tends to try to avoid the emotions, and then the mysticism fills the gap. That works as long as the mysticism is regarded as more general, more universal than the science. And what I found discussing with other people, a whole bunch of people, I found that all religions and all theologians that I've encountered so far have some core of mystery with their concept of God and theology. Mysticism, it works great as an inspiration. Eventually, it becomes a dog in the manger. Now, let's look at the adding content to this. In order to do that, we need to look at abstract versus concrete thought. Okay, there are the two diagonals, abstract and concrete. Concrete, server actions to reach a goal. So my goal, I'm thirsty, I take the server action of drinking. But if you look on the diagram, there's no direct connection. You have to go through perceiver and contributor. What that means is you take your experiences, you place them within a map of perceiver thought, and then you choose what action you're going to be doing because the contributor thought does the choice. Abstract thought, you have the words in teacher thought, there's your blue line, and the perceiver adds the meanings to there. There's an implicit intermediate there of the server thought, which chunks. So it takes the string of verbal noise and subdivides it into chunks, and then you assign meanings to it, and that assigning is arbitrary as illustrated by different languages. Okay, that's the general thing there. Now, why is there concrete and abstract thought? It appears the main reason is because we as humans can either talk or we can do. So the ability to talk seeds abstract thought. The ability to do seeds concrete thought. Now, Jason talked about coherence and correspondence. Teacher thought looks for the coherence. It wants order within complexity. It wants everything to fit together. Perceiver thought looks for the correspondence. How does this connect with various facts? Okay, now let's look at the technical thought. We started with mental networks. Let's look at technical thought. Technical thought is controlled by contributor mode, which ties together perceiver and server. It is a tighter version of normal thought. What happens is in concrete thought, you get contributors, perceiver plus server, and that's a one-to-one mapping. So what happens when you connect a fact and perceiver thought with an action and server thought? You get cause and effect. Cause and effect is here, the fact leads from here temporally to that other situation. So that appears to be the building block for concrete technical thought, the connection of cause and effect. Then concrete technical thought takes these links of cause and effect, puts them into plans to reach goals. But they are using a toolkit of well-known facts and well-known actions. For example, a game like chess. Okay, you know exactly what the playing field is, know exactly what the pieces are, you know exactly what each piece can do. Abstract thought. It's like abstract technical thought. It's like abstract thought, but you have precise meanings in perceiver thought, and you have well-formed expressions in server thought. You can see that with math. There are only certain ways to express, and everything has precise meanings. That brings us back to Dirac's statement. Interpreted cognitively, what he's saying is the abstract math with its precise definitions overlaps with the concrete cause and effect discovered by observation. So it's not that Dirac is saying that abstract and concrete overlap. He's saying that using abstract technical thought and using concrete technical thought, that overlaps. And an example of that is a machine. For example, a car. A car from concrete thought can be viewed as a tool, a plan to reach from point A to point B. But the mechanic views the same car as using abstract technical thought as a bundle of functions with shape that come together to integrate, to perform an integrated function. So there's a concrete, a physical example of the overlap between abstract and concrete technical thought. Okay, now let's look at the wings of technical thought, the perceiver and the server. On the perceiver side, you have Platonic forms. Cognitively speaking, the way mental symmetry explains a Platonic form is that experiences in mercy thought, perceiver thought comes up with a category. For example, facts of roundness. Teacher thought then comes up with a theory of roundness. And that theory, the essence of roundness, then creates an imaginary image of the essence of roundness. For example, you think about a circle, you don't think about real circles, you think about the ideal circle. A Platonic form is based in reality, but it's ideal. So you have real circles, but the Platonic form is more ideal than any real circle. On the other hand, the server side, server deals with sequences. You have the exemplars. An exemplar is, and I'm using Thomas Kuhn's definition here. When you solve a problem, you take the steps, server sequences, you take the steps of solving a problem, that's concrete, but by solving one problem, you learn a recipe that applies to many similar problems. So it is, where are we here? It's based in theory, but the process of learning and carrying it out is concrete. Now, let's look at the typical high school physics problem. You start with a real world problem. For example, a mass on a pulley. Then you replace everything with the Platonic forms. It's an ideal mass, no friction. The pulley has no mass, etc., etc. Then, now that you're in abstract thought, you use abstract technical thought of mathematics to solve it. But what method do you use? You use the methods that you have learned through the exemplars of learning physics. And then when you go back to reality, you have a precise answer in math, but you need to add a fudge factor when you're going back to reality. Okay, so there's just an example of how this is happening in your typical math physics problem. Now, you see the same, now we're going to turn to Christianity, concept of incarnation. You see the same overlap between, a similar overlap between abstract technical thought and concrete technical thought in incarnation. So Jesus Christ, the word Jesus means salvation. Jesus was the name given to the person who lived in concrete thought. And why it says you will give his name Jesus because he will save people from their sins. Okay, that's a plan. It's a presumably technical plan, but it's a plan that saves people rather than just things. So it adds the subjective concept, the subjective aspect of mercy mental networks. Christ, the label means anointed one, the label given to Jesus, Jesus Christ. There you have the divine side, the mathematical side, if you wish, and then guided by the universal teacher mental network of God the Father, looking at this cognitively. Now, mysticism takes the teacher theory and the mercy experience, jams them together directly through identification and overgeneralization. When you do that, you can't add content. Incarnation takes these two and bridges them through concrete and abstract technical thought. You have the intermediary between God and man in using religious language. Now, if you look at incarnation, the description in the Gospels, you find that it contains these both sides, both the exemplars and the Platonic forms. Exemplar, one of the key Christian doctrines, the Word made flesh. So Word, there's your teacher. words made flesh, there's your actions, the teacher and server connecting. And, several times in the Gospels, Jesus says, well, I only do what I see the Father doing. There's your example of an exemplar. On the right side, the Platonic form, talking about Jesus as born of the Holy Spirit. Yes, he's real, but he's more perfect than anything in reality. Human, but sinless. There's this concept of Platonic forms. So you can see a match there. And so that's mental symmetry says, how do you formulate a concept of incarnation? Well, it's similar to the overlap between abstract and concrete technical thought that you find in science, using that as an analogy. And then if you look at the nature of Judaism and especially Protestant Christianity, Judaism, there's the word halakha, which means doing or going. So for Judaism, law is something you do, has to do with exemplars. For Christianity, belief, well, this is a fact, I believe in it, has to do with perceiver. So you can see these two wings of incarnation connecting, expanding incarnation. Now, let's look at the situation of humanity. And I think Jason said something similar previously. Piaget described the process of how the childish mind becomes more mature. Pre-operational stage, if you look at it cognitively, you can interpret it as a mind that's governed by mercy mental networks, emotional, experiential mental networks acquired from the physical body. Well, let's look at some of the traits of the pre-operational stage. These are Piaget's terms. Animism. Well, everything use mental networks to represent people. Make-believe. You don't think in terms of law, you're pretending. These mental networks, they represent imaginary people. Intuition, you're jumping from one mental network to another rather than using logic. Egocentrism, you think in terms of the mental networks of people, and that imposes itself. Centration, there's nothing to balance these mental networks. Artificialism, everything is controlled by mental networks that represent living beings. And there's no cause and effect thinking, transductive. So you can find lots of examples of groups and thinking that is emotionally stuck at this pre-operational stage. So for tribalism, wokeism tends to think in terms of, well, the basic thing of wokeism is that everything is controlled by people and their opinions. Conspiracy theories, well, some person is controlling this. So yeah, you can see this thinking illustrated. How do you escape it? Because you want to become mature. You want to go from this fragmented mercy mental network to an integrated understanding, as illustrated by Dirac's progression from the tribal gods to a more universal God. Well, look at Piaget. Concrete operational thought is next. Starting from the concrete, you can build structure. And then finally, you get to the formal operational stage. You can then think abstract. Now, here's the problem with mysticism or any other form of overgeneralization. It doesn't like facts. So you aren't going to be able to go further. You'll get stuck at this level if you are held together by some form of teacher overgeneralization, be it religious, be it secular. For example, universal tolerance is also an overgeneralization. Okay, this is how the educational method, how you get from the concrete to the abstract, what I call absolute truth. It's a simulation of adult thought formulated for the child. What you do is you tell the child, okay, you learned everything from your parents or other authority figures. Here, we are the new authority figures. We are your teacher. We are your priest. We are your pastor. Here is the new source of truth in these books, holy book, textbook. This overrides anything you have learned earlier. Now, a book by its very nature is a physical illustration of an ordered theory because it takes words and puts them into a structure, and the words have meaning. You can take this book And you say, yes, this was written by an important person, but you can take that book and you can study it apart from the source. So it's it's an example, an illustration of a theory packaged for the childish mind. So the student or the believer starts with blind faith. This is true because my teacher says it's true and it's in the textbook or the Bible or whatever the holy book is. Hopefully, the student learns to think about it. It's the light bulb that goes on top of the head, developing critical thinking. If the book is coherent, if it contains inherent order, you can go beyond, you can develop the teacher mental network of an understanding. The light bulb can go on. If the book corresponds to reality, like hopefully a science textbook does, then it's possible to move beyond this book is true because some important person says it's true to this book is true because it corresponds with reality. So those are requirements for a textbook and or holy book. Now, the problem with the mindset of absolute truth is the source of truth is much more important than my personal feelings. So that mindset will automatically impose a mindset of self-denial upon the thinking. And that mindset of self-denial will interpret the book, no matter what the book says. And I found that looking at theological discussions about the Bible. Very interesting. And now, suppose that your esteem for the source of authority fades. If it's somewhat faded, you can have a revival or some fervor, nationalistic fervor, or something that brings it back, and then that'll reestablish your respect for the source of authority. That works. But what happens if it's faded too much? Then the people who try to bring back the esteem, they become the sources of truth, and you end up with a dictatorship instead of reestablished belief in absolute truth. Okay. Now we look at one of the core doctrines of Christianity, atonement. Atonement is how do you deal with the fact, I still got 8 minutes. Okay. How do you deal with the fact that there is a discrepancy between fractured personal identity, these mercy mental networks, and an integrated understanding, a concept of God? Well, the absolute truth method says God is bigger than you. God says your sins are forgiven. Therefore, you believe God rather than believe humanity. That's the standard way of teaching atonement with a mindset of absolute truth. Problem is, that messes up with your sense of cause and effect. I mean, yeah. I mean, if you eat too much chocolate cake, you get fat. You can't override that. So, but there's another way of dealing that I've found of basing a Christian doctrine of atonement using a school analogy. And this appears to be compatible with mental structure. What you're doing is you're building upon the teacher mental network of the school and its structure. Okay, Harvard School, it has real order, has real structure. I really respect that in teacher thought. When the student enrolls in that school, the student immediately acquires the status of being a student. So that the student now becomes an example of the teacher order. In religious terms, that's called justification. And this, similar to the way that math equations function outside of time, this feeling is timeless. The beginning student immediately feels, I am justified because I'm now a member of the school. Then the student following the courses gradually passes the classes. That's religiously known as the process of sanctification. And that happens within the arrow of time. So this mental trick or mental mechanism will work because it feels bad, to be honest, about personal inadequacies. So you need some sort of emotional covering. This does work as long as the school system does replace your cultural, childish mental networks with an integrated understanding. If the school system breaks down, then you end up with an absolute truth version where the school says, you're educated. Why? Because I'm more important than your parents and other people. So, yeah. And so then that you can reinterpret Christianity as enrolling in a school of character development. And the goal, cognitive wholeness. Okay, I think we got 2 slides left. We've looked at a concept of God the Father. We've looked at the concept of incarnation. Now let's look at the Holy Spirit, the third person of the Trinity. Now, again, we'll deal with Plato. We looked at Plato for his Platonic forms. Plato said that these connect together to form a form of the good. Now, that can happen if you have a meta theory. If you have a meta theory and teacher thought, all your images of possible perfection, they connect together to form an integrated concept of possible perfection in mercy thought. It's concept, it's a divine concept because it's universal, but it's a derived mental concept. Holy because it's a derived, spirit because it's internal. Now, 2 ways that you can get this concept of divine universality. One is if you live in some interconnected environment, like a physical jungle or a concrete jungle, where everything ties together experientially, you'll get a concept of divine spirit. Or if you get an understanding of how everything fits together, you'll get an internal concept of Holy Spirit. Difference is the external one is based upon what is, whereas the internal one is based upon what could be. Critical difference there. Now, this also works if you have blind faith in a holy book. The thing is, your concept of the Holy Spirit and heaven and possible perfection will be divorced from reality because the concept came from a book that is divorced from reality. It'll guide you but you can never realize it. How do you take a holy book and apply it to real life? Sorry. 2 more slides. Righteousness is another concept, religious concept. The key thing here is that when a mental network is triggered, it emotionally imposes itself upon the mind. Therefore, whatever mental network motivates a behavior will take ownership of that behavior. We see that in the court of law, okay? Premeditated murder versus manslaughter. What was the motivation? Now, you can get a change in ownership, and we're looking at cognitive economy. If the old mental network doesn't motivate and a new mental network does motivate. Now, that's where free will comes in. If you have different mental networks, you can choose, this one will motivate me rather than this one. Looking at some examples. Suppose that I choose to follow my rational understanding rather than social mental networks. Now you have a cognitive change in ownership. I become a person of integrity. I follow the facts rather than just social pressure. Suppose that I follow my understanding of how things work rather than social pressure. Now you acquire the character of being righteous. That's related to Kant's categorical imperative. Suppose that I follow my internal mental networks of what could be rather than external mental networks of social pressure. I become holy, which means technically set apart according to God. That's the Greek definition. Values versus goals. Okay, final slide. The phrase asking Jesus into your heart is often used, and it can be interpreted cognitively. It was popularized in the 1950s during a time of post-war prosperity. Now, we looked at science and technology, the machine what happened is, especially in the 1950s, science and technology came up with all these brand new gadgets. So you get this implicit concept of modernism can save my world. It's making my world better. Jesus in my heart takes that implicit mental concept and personalizes it, saying, there's something else. I'm going to ask that Jesus, that salvation, into my heart of subjective identity in order to save myself. It's a mental trick, but it works. And what it's doing is it's taking the objective thinking of science and technology and it's trying to add a subjective component to it. And it's using subjective language that, yeah, oh, that's my timer. I'm out of time.
That's okay. Go continue.
Okay. And so this functioned intuitively, which is what it's being taught as. And that's it. Ha! Perfect timing.
Huh. Jerry wants to say something?
Oh, really?
Well, so I first of all, let me make some general comments because I thoroughly enjoyed your presentation. It's really an excellent piece of work, and I can understand quite well why you've spent several years putting together these concepts together into what I would almost call a Cantorian diagonalization of human intelligence or human emotion, because it's a diagonalization, which is not only a geometric term to cross the bridge between either I and thou, or it and they, or plus and minus, if you would, etc. So,
By the way, I've gone through Buber's I and Thou.
yeah, I'm not surprised. So, Lorin, as you were speaking, I decided to label you as the master of metaphor.
Fair enough. Because I am a perceiver person, and that's how perceivers
You
think.
are. You're signing another grade to Larry. Okay. They all have something to say.
Well, I agree with Jerry that it was fascinating to listen to you. And the main reason for me was that you are using a new language consisting of a number of concepts, in which you explain things like asking Jesus into my heart and atonement, etc. So it is a different language, and it raises a number of questions, because if you use a different language, each of the words have a different meaning from the previous one, and it wasn't always clear to me what that meaning was. So for me, it's my questions, in fact, are a little bit, you might say, on the margin of what you have been telling us, but I hope you don't mind. The first marginal question is, it's not clear to me how free will follows from your system of 7 main schemes. Could you explain that a little bit more?
Okay, looking at personality, we noted that the contributor person has the strongest will. So it seems that contributor mode is the part that chooses. Now, what happens is exhorter happens before contributor, exhorter pushes, contributor chooses. Now, what happens is exhorter gives a few choices, choice A, B, C, D, and then however many, and then contributor chooses. So it's not a total free will where you can choose anything. It's a choosing between various emotional alternatives. Now, the exhorter part gets its emotions largely from mental networks. So if all your mental networks are pushing in the same direction, your choice is going to be somewhat like a Russian selection election. Do you want comrade A or comrade B? If society is split into into different streams, and those streams have formed mental networks in your mind, then free will becomes much more open, much more has many more options and can make much bigger choices. Yeah, so I see free will as limited but real.
But it's not part of the seven networks.
It's each cognitive style seems to have its own version of free will, so that
Ah,
I, as a perceiver person, am going to indirectly affect free will by choosing what facts I think about. But the actual free will part appears to be in the contributor module mapped onto the basal ganglia. So that seems to be where the actual choices are happening. So I'm looking at the choice within the context of where the choices are coming from.
and the choices are coming from alternatives, and the alternatives are actually applications of the networks.
Sorry, say that once more.
Yeah, um, I'm still wondering about the place where you see free
Oh,
will.
okay.
So I was thinking, suppose I have these seven perceiver, etc. I have them in front of me somewhere,
Okay.
but you know them by heart, I'm sure.
There they
Yeah,
are. Okay, there.
each of them can be used in combination with others,
Yes.
I understand. And by doing that, I can create a number of alternatives.
Yes.
Then I make a choice from the set of alternatives.
Yep.
And my question is, where does the choice come from? That is, you explained it, but it is not very clear to me how you can A, make a combination of different networks and then choose from the combination.
Okay. Mental networks and emotions, regular emotional experiences, that's either teacher or mercy, experience
Uh,
or theory. The exhorter, dopamine, the pushing, the drive, looks for something exciting there or there, teacher or mercy. That creates a drive that goes through the arrow to the contributor. The contributor, then, based upon the facts and skills, chooses which drive or which image or which urge is going to be followed. And then the facilitator takes that digital decision and makes it more analog. That's how I would explain it.
okay, it seems that the free will is then part of the whole system.
Yeah,
Okay, then that's clear. I have another question, if you don't mind, Jerry.
I see Jerry's hand. He's next.
Let me,
Yes,
well, Gerard, could I just push your point here a little bit further? And then you, just because it's immediate
sure,
to this issue.
we
Uh,
have time.
yeah. So when I was talking about the either or situation, the abstract or the concrete, uh, you're hitting exactly upon the point that I have hit upon in the trying to develop the logic of of chemistry, the logic of life, the relationships. So within that context, the question of how you would synthesize six different networks into a single conclusion is very parallel to Gerard's point of view that he has expressed in a somewhat different language. But where in my case, for example, if I wanted to put mathematics on top of this diagram, well, I would say, oh, my, I have six different independent and unrelated vector spaces, and somehow I got to draw a conclusion from that. So I think that's an overstatement, a purposeful exaggeration on my part, but go ahead, Gerard.
Okay, just to look at that.
Yes,
Getting these seven modules to work together is a lifelong struggle. And I would say that's how I would that's that is my moral standard. That is how I define morality, as whatever causes the modules to function and to function together.
Hmm.
So it's not an easy problem. It's a lifelong struggle.
I can imagine that. Maybe a more detailed question. You have used the word overgeneralization frequently. If I take a special example in science, the main goal is actually to reduce overgeneralization by a process which is called what is it called now? The word escapes me at the moment, where you try to find some examples that falsification, that falsify what you
Yep.
are claiming. So falsify requires two things. First, there must be a set of things that can falsify possibly. And secondly, there must be something that can be falsified. And so there is a mapping between the set and some statement, usually called proposition. So what we are trying to do, what people in science trying to do, is to identify some form of mapping such that the set and the mapping are equivalent to each other, such that there are no new elements of the set that can be found, and such that always any type of element of the set can be derived from the mapping. That is the usual definition that is in most textbooks. I wonder another thing. Many of the examples that you gave are actually about sets that are not closed in the sense I just described, but are open. And that means that they can be not mapped onto a proposition. So I wonder what you would call in your language that on which you try to map an open set of facts, if you wish, of things to be collected.
Okay. What we're looking at there, the way I would interpret it, as the interaction between normal thought, the analogies, and technical thought. Just looking briefly at this, at the progression, teacher thought comes up with the overgeneralization, likes to make a universal statement. Perceiver thought comes up with the fact that is a counterexample. That's not technical thinking. That's just normal
No.
thinking, statement, counterexample. Then technical thought looks at that and says, let's make this more rigorous. We need to use specific, well-defined server sequences and carefully and perceiver meanings that are carefully defined. So let's put it, that's now abstract technical thought, math-like language in order to state this more formally, which is what you're asking me to do. Now, what I'm looking at that, and I'm saying, yeah, that works really well, but what happens is it only works within some specialization. And now, if you continue doing that, you've got this forest of all these specialized trees, and how do you connect them together? Now you have to go back to the analogical way in which you're using perceiver thought as metaphors and analogies to try to pull it together. So is that a closed technical way of thinking? No. Is it compatible with technical thinking? At least partially.
Let me say something.
It cannot be compatible with technical thinking because we are talking about different sets. Now, what you exemplified, for example, atonement, is, in my mind, it is a mapping of a series of perceptions, if you wish, or things that you might perceive, and it is being mapped onto something you call atonement. But atonement in itself is not a proposition. It is something that refers to the future. So in that sense, it's more like an instruction. You want to atone, then you have to do this. would you agree that what you have been talking about is mainly instructions, heuristics, maybe?
Okay, the whole point of atonement is that you're using a mental trick in order to get beyond that sequence. Because if you look at um, discussions in science on the arrow of time, concrete thought, everything works within an arrow of time. Weird thing is when you're dealing with the equations in abstract thought, you get free of the arrow of time, you can move both ways. So the way I'm interpreting atonement is you're taking advantage of that. You're saying, hey, you are at an abstract thought, a member of this school. You have this status, emotional status of being the school. That is timeless. Now, in concrete thought, that's justification. In concrete thought, you have to follow the process of taking the classes. That's your sanctification.
Okay.
Well, let me
Yeah.
disagree with Gerard this time a little bit, because I think, Gerard, you fast forward too quickly at this stage. I think this is a great effort, Lorin, and we had chatted something around this before. He's actually trying to charter the water, not just map it. Once I visited an aircraft carrier and see the control room and people working on those maps. So I asked them, what kind of maps are you using and what are you doing here? And they say, we are not mapping, we are charting the water. And so I said, what's the difference between map and the chart? Okay, they say charting is more precisely, you have to dig out what's underwater, what's going on at the bottom of the sea, and the stones, the rocks, and the streams, things like that. And everything needs to be controlled. So coming back to our brain, it's kind of like a small black hole that everyone of the carry one, and we cannot open it to see what's exactly detailed, except the neuroscientists. They're studying those neurons and the neural networks, but it's far from these conceptual models that can explain to normal people more clearly. So my question to Lorin, I have two questions. Is the connection. The first one is connection with Piaget that you mentioned briefly. Piaget used a framework of association versus assimilation to describe the process of absorbing new information and new data from outside, and making that little bookshelf in our brain more tidy, or sometimes even to throw the old bookshelf and install a new one. So that's Piaget's. What I understand from Piaget's perception towards this direction. The second one is MBTI, Myers-Briggs type indicator, that was purely based on Ron's work. So it's a lot of a similarity here that your work with Ron's work, but MBTI used to be very popular among the PhD students, but to the training industry, MBTI test, and even for the HR department, when they decide who is best fit to what job, they fear MBTI is too complicated because it's generated 16 different categories based on three dimension three distinctions on three dimensions. And here, Lorin's model, I see it as also a crash down three-dimension model. Actually, your abstract and concrete could be on the Z axis, and so analytical, associative at X axis, emotion and confidence on the Y axis. So abstract and concrete is actually on the top, on the vertical one, the Y, the Z axis. So you actually identify 8 different locations in this framework. And I'm glad that you put a facilitator as someone conclusive and overall control. I did facilitation for our Winthrop work back in China for multiple years. So, but using that metaphor of a black hole, our brain as a black hole, these are all flashlight efforts shooting into the black hole to see what's exactly there. I think we can go to Gerard's phase of falsification and the mathematical quantification much later, if we could build up a pretty good kind of frame first. Jared.
Yeah, well, 2 things. One, Jason, I appreciate your comments with regard to the black hole analogy. But in contrast to the black hole analogy or metaphor that you suggest, which is purely a physical speculation at this point, he asserts in the very beginning that these are all due to biochemical processes limited and constrained by certain specific molecules in the brain. So that was the first slide. And this is, I think it goes back to where Gerard was starting from. So that you differed on the roots and the basis. And I certainly also disagree here. And the source of the disagreement is closely related to Gerard's view on the question of what's the nature of a proposition in relationship to open sets. And in Lorin's view, the relationship between the abstract and the concrete appears to follow directly from Frege's notion of the relationship of how concepts are formed in mathematics and the limitations of mathematics versus those in ordinary language. So there's beneath the logic of this diagram are, if you would, within the black hole that you're describing, Jason, there are this concept of how do you make propositions from, if you would, from black holes. And if you're going to make them from black holes, Lorin is saying, well, I have to first make them abstract and concrete. But this is not what Frege was saying about mathematics. Frege was saying that the concepts themselves are necessarily limited and bounded in what they can do and how these are constructed. So I wanted to, so from that point of view, I wanted to ask Gerard how he would relate the notion of black holes and its physical mysticism to the notion of an open set and the statements that come from open sets, or the, if you would, the impredicability is the word that mathematicians use, of statements from open sets.
Well, it reminds me of an example. At some point in time, somebody started to think about the square root of -1. And at the time, that person was ridiculed. It was considered not to be a real question. But that person was actually forcing the idea of numbers into a preconceived set. The set of numbers, which as it developed eventually, the set of all numbers includes the square root of -1. but it took an enormous effort to actually manipulate that enforcement. So there are lots of things in open sets that people try to force into something, but very seldom succeed. One of them is this example. I mean, it's just one of an example that you mentioned, atonement. Is it something like the square root of -1, or is it something that is beyond that? And the same applies to the notion of a black hole, I think. Is it something that I can actually incorporate into my building of different types of mappings of observations of what I consider a shared world? Or is it something that is still on the level of atonement? And atonement to me is not a proposition. It's a link to a future that isn't there.
Yeah, that gets to the essence of the issue of, the logical notion and what is not expressed in this figure, and that is the connectivity. What is the linguistic connectivity between the arrows in the diagram and the the abstraction in the concrete, basically. You've given us a large number of metaphors which try to persuade us, and in some cases they do, that these arrows are actually something that are connectors, that they're logical connectors, such as conjunction, disjunction, etc. But that is a very tough thing for me to develop from the absence of precision of these words. And so I stop there. Okay.
See, I hear I hear all what you're saying, and what I'm hearing in my head is various aspects of technical thought. And the methodology I used was analogical. I started with this model that came from a study of personality, and then I started to ask your sorts of questions. How do I add precision to this? Does this make any sense at all? Well, let's study these various fields and see if I can apply the model, if I can use that set of glasses to look at these fields, and maybe that'll add some details to my model. So I have put together a paper on linguistics and have looked at it extensively. I have, at this point, I've gone over 2/3 of the New Testament in the original Greek in order to see that, hey, do my concepts map up with the original meanings? I have really tried to learn the technical thinking, the sort of thing that you gentlemen are using. Can my model extend in that direction? Myers-Briggs, I've looked at Myers-Briggs. What is the mapping on that? Each time I do that, this diagram seems to survive, but I also gets details added to it, which would take time to mention. So yes, I'm trying to deal with your questions, but I'm dealing it with from a different perspective.
I forgot to mention. I forgot to mention before. When I talk about the Myers-Briggs, I want to say in the training industry, a lot of training companies simply did a shrinking of 16 into 4. So there are multiple versions of 4-quadrant perceptions about human personalities. The very popular one in China is they use 4 colors. So they are red color, they are yellow color, and blue color, and green color. So green is the person who are very perceiving and mercy and easygoing, and yellow is a very strong controller. It wants to teach and exhort and push his or own opinions upon others. And the red representing a very outgoing, happy-go-lucky, and very sociable, talk to everyone and everything. Yes, that kind of a person. Things like that. And also there are models using for seasons. So they say you are a spring person, you are a summer person, you are an autumn person, you're a winter person, things like that. Uh, so that's another two extreme. The good, too simple, in Lorin's word, not very accurate, but popular. I mean, those training companies, they made very huge sales and very popular in corporate training. So what I see this effort is we are building up something more reliable and more link back to logic and our existing knowledge, and not just Rome, not just Myers-Briggs, but we can link to like self-organizing system theory and like a multiple layer self-organizing system. And this will link to Jerry's work. Jerry focused on the chemical level, and the chemical level, on the neural network level, and generated something we call concept, right? So McCullough's paper is about how did you get a concept? And then the concept becomes symbols, and then languages, and then developing the whole pie of the tower. Um, so, so I think at this point, we need to keep an open mind and welcome all good tries. I think Lorin has a very good candidate of a good try. Like this is another flashlight in my metaphor, another flashlight shining into the spring that we all trying hard to understand. And I think Gerald's questioning was trying to make it more clear of the inner structure or the inner scapegoat, that thing surrounding the building. Is that called a scapegoat? Scapegoat?
Scaffold.
Scaffold.
Oh yeah, that's what that's so I mean, we are currently build up those things, and we're trying to dig out. And ideally, if we could reach some consensus to finalize a better model, I mean, better than Myers-Briggs, that would be super. If you guys are interested.
Just a
I
quick
am
comment on
not
Myers-Briggs. Thinking maps onto perceiver without mercy. So it's the objective facts. Feeling maps onto mercy without perceiver. So it's the emotional experiences without facts. Sensing maps onto server without teacher. So it's the concrete sequences without the thinking. Intuition maps onto teacher without server. So you're doing the abstract thought without looking at the concrete sequences. So the problem I have, the biggest problem I have with Myers-Briggs is it's a bunch of walls. You're this, not that. And so what I'm trying to do is look at how do you these, and I'm thinking in terms of modules that tend to separate, but they can function together.
like to
But
add.
some are more dominating than the other.
It's not easy to get them to work together.
Mhm. So that's explained why facilitator role is the most difficult one.
Well, that's the facilitator wants freedom within structure. If there's no structure, they'll say, we want order. If there's no freedom, they say, we want freedom. So it's how do you get that combination? And it seems with absolute truth, you don't have that combination because this is the truth. Don't adjust it. So, yeah.
To my mind, you did a wonderful piece of work, especially as you say that you read the Bible in Greek, in original Greek. I've had a training in Greek as well, but I must admit I wouldn't be able anymore to read the Bible in that language.
Just
Um,
interlinear at level. I'm not a master at Greek.
okay. Um, a Greek background and Latin background helps, of course, in many situations. What I would like to add is that, well, let me first start by saying I admire what you have done. Then I ask myself, not is it wrong, but is it, you might say, coherent in the sense that you explained that you try to make it into something technical and that you reduced the variety that you were engaging with. And that is precisely the point, I think, where Jerry, at least, and I are asking you about, which is not a criticism, but it is the question, did you go far enough? Did you make it clear, at least, for example, I mean, I come back to atonement because that's an interesting topic for me, that atonement is the kind of thing that in, let us say, the technical world would be considered a theory. So is it something that is abstract and that there is some concrete set of events or observations such that it is reasonable to say this is abstract? I always have difficulty with the distinction between concrete and abstract. Is my cup of coffee concrete? Well, that depends very much on how I think about it. Is an author concrete or abstract? Well, it depends very much on what I'm thinking about. To Foucault, it's completely abstract, but to me, it is very concrete because I sit on my desk and I write. So the point my questions were just as I mentioned in the beginning, not essential, but in the margin. Is it possible to say that atonement is not what you try to explain in terms of your language, but that is something that is, you might say, inherent to your language? That is actually the question I'm asking. There are many things in certain languages. In the Bible, God is inherent in the language. But in, let us say, as I said, in the question, what is pi? Pi wasn't inherent in the original language, but became inherent in the new language. And so I wondered whether atonement was something that is now in the new language, or that it still has an outside function that you have to explain. Sorry.
Okay, we're getting into that. There are at least half a dozen different theological interpretations of atonement, and it is very interesting. I've taken a brief look at them from a cognitive perspective, and the school analogy seems to be one that works without messing up with the structure of the integrated mind. Okay, that's why I'm suggesting it. I see Jerry's hand. I just want to add in terms of completeness, something that I haven't mentioned, and that while I look at neurology a lot, I see that, and I really try to ground my theory in neurology. I don't take a materialistic viewpoint of saying everything is just chemicals. I think that there is a mind that's independent of the brain, but that there is an extensive and detailed overlap between the two. And it's interesting, you can extend this model if you take the same cognitive model and attach a different body to it, one that concrete thought, because it comes from the body, you attach a different interface to it, you can come up with a rational explanation for spiritual and supernatural stuff. So it seems like you can extend the cognitive model into those other directions as well, if you wish.
Jerry?
Yeah, I'd like to return to Jason's point of view and also Gerard's comments, because I first think, Lorin, that you ought to understand that neither Gerard nor I are really being critical of your basic work. It is really a substantial piece of work that you are putting forth here. It has a lot of originality. It is interest across multiple disciplines, and you are to be congratulated for that. And I appreciate the opportunity to listen to you today. So I know from my own experiences and most people, when faced with comments such as Gerard and I are making, you're certainly become defensive, and that's understandable. But so don't take, just want to make that clear. Second,
Okay, yeah, I just to say thank you, and I'm really trying to understand what you're saying and deal with it, trying to answer in an adequate manner. And I respect all of your areas of expertise, and I'm trying to learn from it.
Okay, let me make one more comment before
Yep.
Jason starts. And I don't want to cut off Jason's time, but the issue
Okay.
comes
I can
back,
always speak.
comes back to the use of symbols. And this is what is of deep concern to me in this context. And the point of interdisciplinary work is that it is necessary to shift between the mathematical symbols and what they might mean to the individual versus the physical symbols and what they might mean to the individual, and the chemical symbols, what they might mean to individuals, the genetic symbols and what they might mean to individuals, and the medical symbols, which they might mean to each others. And then finally, of course, you have religious symbols, which they might mean to the individuals. And so the implication of how do all of these symbol systems work together? How do they become a unitary thought that is, or a unitary conceptualization of how nature works or how our minds work? And it's this interrelationships among the numerous symbol systems, which I have tried to address in my previous talks here, and which I'll continue in the next presentation that's in progress of being arranged. So thank you so much.